Thank you for that kind introduction, President Cornwell. As President Cornwell mentioned, he was my boss when I taught at Rollins, and I guess technically, as one of my constituents, he's still my boss, as are many of you in this room. But he is someone I greatly admire and the leader of an educational institution dedicated to preparing students to become global citizens and responsible leaders. And I think that's a really worthy goal and one that I believe aligns with the mission of many of those who are in the room today. I want to thank the USGLC for inviting me to speak. Thank you, Jason. I'm really honored to be here, and I'm looking forward to answering your questions about my experience in Congress, about the totally, completely normal political situation we have right now in Washington, and also about the need for U.S. foreign policy to be more strategic, predictable, and rooted in our core values. But before that, I'd like to offer some brief remarks to frame our discussion and to share my personal outlook, which stems from my own life experiences. You know, I'm somebody who believes the United States can protect its interests and promote its values most effectively when we exercise strong and smart leadership around the world, using all the tools of that are in our geopolitical toolbox, from defense to economic statecraft to diplomacy to development assistance. I think that's really the best way to strengthen America and to strengthen Florida specifically. But to give you a little bit of perspective of where I come from on all of this, as many of you know, I was born in Vietnam a few years after the Vietnam War ended. And because both of my parents had worked alongside the U.S. Military as well as the South Vietnamese forces during the conflict, they faced persecution once the communist government began consolidating power in the country. And so in 1979, when I was just a baby, my family fled Vietnam by boat. We were a part of a large wave of migrants in that era who would collectively become known as the Vietnamese boat people. And unfortunately for us, our boat ran out of fuel in the South China Sea. And there we were, dangerously adrift, running out of supplies, when a U.S. Navy ship responded to our SOS call. The American sailors gave us the food, fuel, and water we needed to make it to a Malaysian refugee camp. But these service members were on patrol thousands of miles from America's shores. They were maintaining forward presence, they were deterring conflict, they were ensuring the safe passage of ships involved in international commerce. And on that fateful day that our paths crossed, these men and women who were trained for combat extended grace to desperate strangers. And after several months at a Malaysian refugee camp, again, my family became beneficiaries of American kindness. A Lutheran church in Virginia sponsored our passage to the United States, and eventually we became proud citizens. And we were afforded this opportunity because of deliberate policy choices made in Washington. When Saigon fell to communist forces in 1975, President Ford had allowed for 130,000 South Vietnamese people to migrate to the United States. But after that, America's gates were effectively closed to refugees from Southeast Asia, even though the situation on the ground continued to deteriorate. And when President Carter took office, tens of thousands of families in Vietnam, including mine, were boarding boats and taking their chances on the high seas. And as a result, there was this renewed debate at the highest levels of U.S. government and in this country about what, if anything, to do. And among the American people, it was polling negatively at over 60% in accepting additional refugees. You know, both the American people and a lot of the policymakers had believed that America had done enough. And while others also believed that this country could and should do more. And so President Carter ultimately sided with the advocates for additional action. One official who argued for rescuing and admitting more refugees from Vietnam was the late diplomat Richard Holbrooke, who was then the State Department's Assistant Secretary for East Asia and Pacific Affairs. And he said in testimony before Congress, The motivation is simple. The deep humanitarian concern, which for so long has been a descriptive part of our national character. Going back to that American values piece. And Vice President Walter Mondale had also become a convert to this cause. And in part, this was because he didn't want to repeat the moral and policy failures of the late 1930s, when the United States and other nations didn't do nearly enough to absorb European Jews seeking to escape Nazi Germany. And in that case, the consequences of inaction were catastrophic. And here in Florida, we also turned back the St. Louis, sent many of those people on that ship back to certain death in Europe. So some senior Navy officials were really reluctant at this time in the 70s to use American ships to save Vietnamese refugees. They were saying, you know, this isn't a military mission, but Mondale overruled them. And the Navy soon came to cherish their humanitarian role. And as one ship commander involved in a rescue operation told Mondale, he said, quote, "I thought it would demoralize my sailors, but I was dead wrong. It's going to make a difference to the way those people think about America. Because when their life was at risk, they saw this ship with an American flag come up and these young guys go down and pick them up. They felt safe for the first time in months and probably years. The world looked better to them. It's hard to stay mad at policy like that." And thank God for those brave sailors. And thank God for those courageous and committed policymakers in Washington who argued for action and who waged the bureaucratic battles that were necessary for their position to prevail. We are a better and stronger nation because of them. And quite frankly, I'm alive today because of America's unique combination of leadership, power, and generosity. And as a result, I've always felt a tremendous debt of gratitude to this country. And I believe public service is one way that I get to chisel away at this debt, even though I know I may never, ever fully repay it. And so it was the reason that after the 9/11 terrorist attacks, when I saw my country under attack, that I felt that first call to service. And I wanted to help defend a nation that saved my family's life and had given me a chance to live the American dream. And so I left my job in the private sector and went to work in national security at the Pentagon. And it was really the honor of my life to serve alongside men and women in uniform, like the ones who had rescued my family so many years before. And in an interesting twist of fate, during my tenure at the Pentagon, I actually got a chance to help lead the US military's response to the 2004 tsunami in Indonesia. It was a deeply satisfying turn of fate. 3 decades after the US military saved my life, I had the opportunity to help spearhead the US military's effort to save lives and rebuild communities in another Asian nation. And we were doing so at a time when the US was engaged in 2 military conflicts in the Middle East. And again, seeing the comfort with the US flag flying off the coast of Indonesia, it helped us build this deep reservoir of goodwill for the United States in what happens to be the most populous Muslim country in the world. So, as you can imagine, in light of my experiences, both personal and professional, I'm really skeptical about the arguments that are being made by American politicians, whether they're Republican or Democrats, that the United States should step back from its leadership role on the global stage. I believe that any retreat towards isolationism, however tempting it might appear at first blush, will ultimately make America and its allies less prosperous and make the world a less stable and safe place. I also believe that with great power comes great responsibility. And if America fails to rise to the occasion, the world's suffering will become worse, and eventually the problems of people in other nations will come to become our own problems. And finally, I believe that every nation has an ethos, a national soul, so to speak, and that giving a damn about our fellow human beings in other countries and trying our best to empower them is a fundamental part of the American soul. We lose a piece of ourselves every time we are capable of assisting and we decline to act. And of course, America can't do everything everywhere, and nobody is suggesting that we do. But we can do quite a bit, and we ought to, for both moral and practical reasons. So what then should American global leadership look like? What form should it take? I would summarize it a bit like this. I believe America needs a skilled and well-funded military to deter conflict, to prevail in conflict if deterrence fails, and to train and support the armed forces of our allies so that together we can address mutual challenges before they metastasize into threats. At the same time, I also believe America needs a very well-resourced core of capable, clear-eyed diplomats and aid workers to help pursue peace and reconciliation, to seek justice, to protect our planet, and to combat poverty and hunger and disease. And while on the one hand, I would argue that too many Republican policymakers venerate hard power, and they don't sufficiently value the ability of soft power to advance our nation's security. But to be fair, on the other hand, I think some of my fellow Democrats are right to recognize the benefits of soft power, but are too quick to express skepticism over, and maybe even suspicion, at the prospect of America projecting hard power vis-a-vis another country. We should never be timid of that. And for me, I don't fall into either of these camps. I think hard power and soft power are each essential and often complementary elements of US foreign policy. And while most people associate the Department of Defense with troops, weapons, and a destructive force, and there's some truth to that, from my perspective, I'm someone who has been both the recipient and the provider of DoD humanitarian aid. And the department has effectively used congressionally approved funds to wield soft power as well as hard power. And I think history is clear. You know, while not every problem has a military solution, certain problems do demand an armed response. For example, American military force was required to repel German and Japanese aggression during World War II. And it was required to root out al-Qaeda from its safe haven in Taliban-controlled Afghanistan after the 9/11 attacks. And other geopolitical tools just wouldn't have been sufficient on those occasions, just as they weren't enough to stop the mass killings in Rwanda when the US opted not to intervene militarily. And that's a decision I know many policymakers from that period have come to regret. So in addition, sometimes the use or simply the threatened use of military force can be necessary to create the conditions for a diplomatic initiative to succeed, as it was for Ambassador Holbrooke in the Balkans in the 1990s. All of this underscores the point that there is a critical role for the armed forces in US foreign policy, whether they're exercising hard power or soft power. Policymakers and Democratic policymakers in particular really shouldn't shy away from that fact. But it's an absolute mistake for US officials to provide the military with all the funding it needs, or even more than it's requesting, while starving our diplomats at the State Department and our aid professionals at USAID of the resources that they require to execute their mission. President Trump's budget requests have sought to do precisely that. But to its credit, to date, Congress has rejected those requests on a bipartisan basis, and I expect that we will continue to do so. The truth is that diplomats and aid workers are our nation's first line of defense. They can prevent challenges in other countries from becoming crises and prevent crises from exploding into kinetic kinds of conflict or bleeding over into our borders. Showing respect for these men and women, giving them clear strategic direction, and properly funding their work is of the utmost importance for our nation's security and prosperity, particularly here in Florida. That's because Florida is one of the country's most internationally oriented states. Our economy is highly dependent on international trade, with foreign imports and exports supporting nearly 1 in every 5 jobs in the state. Nearly 22% of Florida's 21 million residents are foreign-born. Of those 4.4 million people, 75% were born in Latin America, 10% born in Asia, and another 10% born in Europe. Many of them came to America and to Florida because of difficult economic or security conditions in their native countries, the very sorts of challenges that U.S. diplomacy and aid are intended to address at the root cause. So to state the obvious, what happens inside other nations often has implications for Florida, whether we're talking about Cuba or Haiti or Colombia or most recently Venezuela. In the past decade alone, the Venezuelan population in Florida has increased by 150%, from 85,000 to 220,000. That's half of the Venezuelan population that is in America is here in Florida. And it's here in Florida primarily due to the failings of, or this growth is primarily due to the failings of the Chavez and Maduro regimes. So what takes place in Venezuela matters directly to us. And that's why I recently authored a successful amendment to the State Foreign Ops Appropriations Bill that would increase funding for the USAID and State Department programs to strengthen democracy, independent media, and the rule of law in Venezuela. My view is really simple. We need to help Venezuelan nationals already living in the United States by granting them temporary protected status or something like it. But we also need to address the factors inside of Venezuela that are causing Venezuelans to flee their country by the millions. Otherwise, we're simply treating the symptom of the disease rather than trying to cure the disease itself. And in closing, I'll say this. You know, one lesson I've learned and relearned over the years, both at DoD and now in Congress, is that there's no neat distinction between foreign policy and domestic policy. And we don't have the luxury of ignoring the former to focus on the latter. It's not a zero-sum game. And to take perhaps the most pressing contemporary example, violence and grinding poverty in the Northern Triangle countries of El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras are driving many citizens of those nations to seek refuge in the United States, which is testing the capacity of our domestic immigration system and causing significant upheaval in domestic politics. This should lead U.S. policymakers, again, for both moral and practical reasons, to redouble our efforts to help these Central American nations address the underlying factors that are spurring the migration. Proposals to cut off aid to these countries, like we've seen from the Trump administration, are terribly wrongheaded. They are inconsistent with our interests and they violate our values. As I said, America has a soul and we ought to protect and preserve it through our actions. So with that, thank you again for inviting me and I look forward to the Q&A. Thank you.